Hello and welcome back. The next thing that I'm going to set up is some projectiles that I can use for my ship's weapons. And in order to have a little more creativity over this process, I will use particle effects to do this. In the hierarchy, I'll right-click, drop down to Effects, and over to Particle System. And then in my transform, I'll reset this so that it's at 0. You can immediately see that I've got particles in my game view and also in my scene view. You likely have orange selection highlighting around the particles in your scene view. And I don't like to work with particles that way. So if you want to turn that off, in your scene view, go to the gizmos drop down and uncheck the selection outline. If that's on, you'll see orange squares. If it's off, you will not. And this just is a little cleaner way of working with the system. If I select the particle system, it will play outside of runtime. And in my scene view, I'll have a playback panel that I can pause, play, I can restart the effect, stop the effect, and so forth. If I do not have the particle system selected, you won't see it run unless the game is actually playing. So with the particle system selected, I'll look in the inspector, and we have a lot of options for things that we can do here with our particle effect. First off, we're looking at a duration of 5 seconds that's looping. And it is emitting, under the emission tab, a rate of 10 particles over that time, and then it loops. And this is not how I want my weapon to work. So I'm going to tell it not to emit anything over time. And instead, down here where we have the burst, I'll click to add. What I'm getting now is a burst of 30 particles every 5 seconds. So if I decrease this duration to, say, 0.3, I now have a burst that's closer to the rate of fire of an actual weapon. I don't necessarily need all of these particles, though. So I'll tell the burst to use a single burst count of 1 and have a duration of 0.3. And for now, I'll leave looping on so that I can see the effect on scene. This is closer, but the particles are very slow, and they're also very random in direction. So at the top of my particle system, I can adjust the starting speed. And if I set this to something, say, like 30, it starts to feel more like a bullet. When the particle lifetime speed increases, it can travel further before it dies because it's moving a greater distance for the same amount of time that it's alive. So I don't need this 5-second lifetime anymore. I can reduce this to maybe 2 or 3 seconds. And the way you want to think about this is if I was in one corner of the screen and I shot diagonally across the screen, I need the particle to live that long, maybe just a tiny bit longer, but not really any longer than that. And you can play around with this based on the size of your actual game. Starting speed is set. We have starting size that we can come back to here in just a minute, but I want to fix this randomization of the particle effect. I want a straight shot in front of the ship. In order to change that, I need to come down to the shape menu. And once I have that open, you can see that I'm actually emitting from a cone shape. And the mode of emission is random. So it's randomly picking a point that is inside of this cone and emitting a particle. So instead of using a shape cone, I'll use edge. Now what you can see is the particle effect is a small edge. Let me focus on my player ship real quick. There we go. And you can see these 2 blue points, and we're randomly emitting between those 2 edges. So I will tell this burst spread. What that does is it reduces it down to a single point instead of it being random. And in order to set this back to the center, I'll reduce the radius to as small as I can, which is 0.0001. And now I've got a particle system that's shooting straight up, but it is shooting in a straight line. In order to get it to shoot forward, you could rotate the transform node, but then we have altered the local space from the world space. And a better way of doing this is below the shape menu, we have position, rotation, and scale. So if I rotate the X to 90 degrees here, you can see that now my particle effect shoots perfectly straight forward, but my transform node hasn't changed. It's still at 0, which is very important. And this makes lining it up in the game later very simple. All right, so we've got a particle, it's shooting forward. I would like to make this particle more interesting. So first thing I'm going to do is I want to have it start big and decrease rapidly in size so that it looks like a blast of energy that then reduces down, so we get a little bit of effect from the blast. And I can do that by, first off, increasing my starting size. So I'll set it to 2. And then I'll come down to size over lifetime and check that. And you can see that we have a curve graph. So if I open the curve graph, it's currently saying that we start out at 0 size and then we go to maximum size, which would be 2. If I rotate my scene view, you can see this. It's really small and then it's getting bigger. And this is basically the opposite effect of what I want. So in my graph curve, I'll find the reverse linear path so that it starts out big and gets smaller. And this is closer to what I want, but I want it to be big for a very short time and then it immediately reduce down. And I can do this by grabbing this far right handle and positioning it closer to the beginning. So the farther left I move, the shorter duration of time it's going to take. The lower the value, or the higher the value, the larger and smaller the particle will be. Another way that we can play with this is to simply right-click on it and say Edit Key. And so I'll give it a duration of maybe 0.1, and then I'll set it to 0.5. So after a time of 0.1, it will reduce itself by half its size. Since it starts at 2, it will wind up at a size of 1. And so now I'm getting a quick burst that reduces in size. Then I can come down to color over lifetime. And this gives us a gradient palette. So if I click on that, you can see that it's currently just white. And if I were to select this first lower arrow and pick the color palette and change the color, I'm now telling it to start red and fade to white. And if I click anywhere down here, I could add in new arrows. I can grab them and drag them off the map if I don't like them. So I have this little preset that I already made that just goes from white to yellow to blue and then back to white. And what that does is it just gives me the effect of a quick burst of energy leaving the ship, and then it's reducing down in size. We can play around with this all day long until we get it to look exactly the way that we want it. But for now, I'll just call this good. There's a lot of different options of things that we can do in here. For this video, I'm going to keep it fairly simple. This effect is good enough for my first weapon type. However, I do need it to collide with something. I need it to collide with enemies and so forth and actually do some damage. Or just send a kill signal to those if I don't want it to actually take damage. So what I'll do is I will make a 3D cube and I'll set it to 0. And then I'm just going to move it forward in the scene. You can see it's directly in front of my ship. And what I want to do is use this object to test whether the collision is set up correctly for my particles. So when I hit play, you'll notice that the particles are shooting straight through the cube. And we need to get this to respond when it hits. So back on the particle system, if I go down to the collision menu and I turn collisions on, the first thing I want to tell it is that yes, we do want to use collisions, and I'm going to temporarily hide my ship so that we're just looking at the particle system and the cube. And then under the collision section, instead of telling it to use planes, I'll tell it to use world. And now you can see that the particle is actually bouncing off of this cube and returning. So it is hitting it. It's not going through it anymore, which is good, but I don't want it to be bouncing. Below this world space, you have the option for bounce. And this number is 0 to 1. It's a linear scale of off to on and the bounce in between. So if I set this to 0, we have no bounce. But now the particles stick to this surface and accumulate until their lifetime kills them, which is also not what I would like. I would like them to hit and immediately die. And we can do that with this lifetime loss setting. When it hits, how much life do I want my particle to lose? I want it to lose all of its lifetime, so I will set it to 1. And now what you'll notice is that the particle hits the cube and immediately disappears. And this is awesome. However, we need the cube to register whether the particle effect has hit it or not. And so to see if we've got our particle system set up correctly, I'm going to go to the cube and just add a quick FSM to this. I'll right-click and add a transition of finished. If you hold Control and drag off of the transition, you can automatically add another state. And then I'll add finished to this and loop it back. So I'm just creating a quick test loop. And in state 1, we need an action that can check for collision. So if I type in collision, the action I want is collision event. The option that we get is, do I want the owner checking for this, which happens to be the cube? Yes, I do. On collision, enter is checking for an object-based collision. I need to actually set this to on particle collision. And then notice it's looking for a tag. So if I go back to my particle system, it's currently set to a tag of untagged. So I'm going to change this. I have a tag called player weapon, so I'll use that. If you don't, you can make a new one. And then I can tell the cube to look for a tag of player weapon. And since I'm using finished as my transition, I'll tell it to send the event finished. And then I'll hit play, and we'll watch this loop to see if the particle actually collides with the cube. And you can see that yes, it is colliding, it is disappearing, but it is not actually triggering this state to change. And the reason that that's happening is on the particle system, if we go back to the collision section, this is set up to collide, but it is not set up to pass any information. And we have to tell it to send the collision message if we want it to do that. So I'll check that box. I'll then select the cube so that I can watch its FSM. And now if it's working, what we should see is this quickly loop. And you can. If I take the particle system and I slow its rate of fire down, you'll be able to see the loop a little more effectively. It's hitting, it's registering, and it goes to state 2. Perfect. So this guy is more or less set up to do what we'd like it to do. So I'll stop the game. And I'll name this really quick. I'll call this I'll call this default weapon. Call it whatever you would like. And then I'll quickly set up another weapon that we can use with a similar particle effect. So I will Control D, duplicate this first weapon. And then to make it a little different, I will go to the color over lifetime and I'll give it a different color over lifetime. So now I've got this yellow to purple gradient. And I want to make maybe a weapon that can burst fire. So I'm going to duplicate this weapon twice, and then under the shape node, I'll take its rotation in Y and set it to maybe 5 degrees, and I'll set this one under its shape in Y to maybe -5 degrees. And if I'd like to see all of these play at the same time, I can just select them all. Now they're all out of sync. So I'm going to say stop, and then I'll hit play. And so now I'm getting a burst of 3 particles with a spread of 5 degrees each direction. And I think the 5 degrees maybe is a little small, so I will set it to be about 7 and see what that looks like. So +7 and -7, and then stop these and restart them. Okay, now I've got this interesting little pulse of 3 particle effects. And in order to get this to work as one unit, I need to basically put it inside of another object, an empty. So I will create a game empty, make sure that it's at 0, and then I will take these particles, maybe I'll rename them really quick, and I'll call this tripulse, and then copy that, name these guys really quick, and then I'll take these 3 particle effects and put them into one single game object. I can now call upon this game object, and it will create these 3 effects at the same time. Now you can actually come in and change the shape to, say, circle, and use a burst spread off the edge, but I find that it's a little trickier to get to react correctly, so I like to do it this way. Alright, now that I've got that guy set up, we need to maybe put some sound on our weapons. So I will select my default weapon, and then I need to add a component of audio source. If I expand that, you can see that it's looking for an audio clip, and it's basically currently set to play on awake. So I'm going to use an audio clip that I already have. If you don't have any, you can download some. I'm going to use this Zero Rare Retro Sound Effects package that is free on the Unity Asset Store. If you'd like to play around with that, go grab it. And then I'm just going to add this Laser 19 sound to this audio source. I will take this Tripulse, might as well name it while I'm here, and I'm just going to hide it so it's out of my scene. Currently I have this default particle effect, and when I hit play and it loads, we should get a sound effect just once, and that's perfect. That's all I really needed. So I've got sound set up on this guy. I will go to my Tripulse cannon and add a audio source, and then I'll pick a different sound clip for it. So maybe this, let's try this laser. I'll do 21 this time. And then I'll hide my default and hit play, and I want to see if this one is working. And it is. Awesome. I apologize if that's hard for you guys to hear. It's coming out of my speakers, but the sound is working. It is effective, and if you set this up the same way, it should also be working for you. The last thing that I really need to do here is uncheck the particle effects from looping. So this default weapon I can turn back on, and then I will uncheck the looping. And then for the Tripulse, if I select all three of the particle effects at the same time, I can uncheck all of those at the same time. I just want them to burst once, play their sound, and be done. And another thing that I also need to do is when my particle system is done, do I want the actual object to continue living or not? And we have a stop action for that. So I will check this to destroy, and I will set these guys down here to destroy, and that just makes sure that these all go away. So my default weapon has an effective particle system and an audio source, and I need to get this set up as a prefab so that I can clone it. So in my project, under my assets folder, I will right click and create a folder and call this folder prefabs. And then I'll open that guy up and take my default weapon and drag and drop it in here. And so now this can be dropped into my scene and used whenever I would like it. However, on my Tripulse weapon, I need to do something else, because the three particle effects are going to die, but this game object that contains them is not. So on the Tripulse object itself, I'll add an FSM. I'll call this maybe the Tripulse lifetime. And I'll name the state that it created as state 1. I'll name this setting lifetime. All I really need to use here is just a wait command. I can just tell it to wait for however long I would like. So I'll set this for maybe 3 seconds, and I do want it in real time. And then I'll tell it when it's done, use a finished event, control drag out another state, and I'll name this state destroy. And the action that I will put in here is destroy self. And so now if this object is created, it will live for 3 seconds. I need to tell it what finished event to use, and since I used a event of finished, I can right click and say finished. And then here, it will die. So if we watch this, I'll hit play. This object should stay in my hierarchy for 3 seconds, and after 3 seconds, it will die. And you can see that it did. It's gone. And that's just a little bit of cleanup work so that I can create this object whenever I would like, and I don't have to worry about whether it persists on in the game or not. So I will go back to my project, prefabs folder, and I will drag and drop this weapon type into the prefabs. And so now I've got a default weapon type, and a tripulse weapon type that are prefabbed, and I can clone these whenever I would like. So I will disable the two that are currently in the scene. In fact, we could actually delete these. I'll leave them for now, but I don't want them actually creating on their own. We want to do this through some kind of firing mechanism. Also don't need this cube anymore, so I will remove it as well. And I have a clean scene. My two particle effects are working. They have sound effects, and they are actually colliding with objects, sending signals. So everything is working very good. All right, we will continue on with our trigger mechanism in the next one.